Okay, good morning. I'm going to be talking about decentralized exchange and particularly our experience of launching a non-custodial exchange 5 months ago. So hopefully that'll be quite relevant to anyone else who's launching any decentralized applications. It may be, some of it may seem, some of the stuff we learned is a bit obvious, but also I think how we learned it was really interesting. So just to give a background for what I'll speak about, the first thing will be to introduce EthCC and the context around what we're doing and our path towards decentralization. And then I'm going to speak more about what it meant to us to try and build something for a mainstream audience and what we thought the major challenges were going to be. And then go into a real in-depth case study of EthCC Trustless, which is our non-custodial exchange, and how naive we were when we started building it and what we learned from the process, and now what we believe the biggest challenges will be for a decentralized exchange to go mainstream and how we might start to tackle those. So the background is that EthCC launched in 2017 as a centralized exchange. So we have an advanced centralized exchange, which is familiar to anyone who's used a cryptocurrency exchange, particularly focused on Ethereum tokens. And when we launched that, the utility tokens were just starting to do many ICOs. It was kind of the early part of communities becoming really, really important to a lot of new Ethereum-based tokens. And it was launched by a centralized company, EthCC. And as part of our launch, we also included the Nectar token. So this is an important part of where we were going, which is that this wasn't sold, but it can be earned by anyone who's using EthCC for trading as a market maker, so for adding liquidity. And that's part of our journey, which is to decentralize in two ways. The first is along our governance. So our eventual aim is to have EthCC and everything it encompasses being governed by a decentralized autonomous organization of Nectar token holders. And so far, over the last 13 months, we've been distributing those to anyone who's trading, and therefore there were already a couple of thousand of traders who own these tokens, and also 50% of the fees that were earned go into a pot, which will eventually be owned by that DAO and used. And so along the way, we've therefore been developing voting tools and other aspects of governance. But on our technology side, which is what I'll mainly talk about today, we've also been making that journey towards full decentralization in inverted commas. And so we launched 5 months ago EthCC Trustless, which is our stepping stone towards that goal. And particularly, this was focused at solving the liquidity issues behind trading in a decentralized way for the kind of higher velocity, more highly traded tokens. So we really split the problem into two, which is that for the long tail of assets, which are never going to have second-by-second price discovery because there just isn't the information and interest to trade them, there are more suitable on-chain solutions, such as Uniswap or other sort of asynchronous trading mechanisms. But we wanted to build something which solved the issue for the higher velocity tokens. And our next step will be to launch a sort of more fully decentralized exchange, which is layer 2 scaling, includes privacy and many other benefits. But what we're learning from Trustless is really shaping how we'll launch that. And why are we doing this? So by the way, of course, we have a centralized exchange. It's already got users, but really what was important to us when we started designing this process was recognizing who the eventual customers would be for anything we built which runs on Ethereum. And we really see it as being the opportunity to serve a whole new generation of customers who are native to blockchain. So companies or sort of protocols like Melonport for decentralized asset management, which can never use a centralized exchange, and they want to interact only with systems which are also open systems and owned by their customers. And so we've designed EthCC from the start to be along those lines. So when we started looking at this problem of how we build for a mainstream audience for a decentralized exchange, we considered it that there were already several decentralized applications out there. Some of them allow trading, and the early adopters were already using these. And so this is the typical adoption curve, which I'm sure many are familiar with, where you have your early adopters who are, of course, very willing to put up with all sorts of problems and bugs, whereas your mainstream users need to have a really strong use case. It has to be really obvious to them for them to want to use these applications. And they can't put up with all sorts of barriers which you might see in an earlier stage product, and that there's a big gap to cross there. And we started to analyze what we thought it was. And I think this was a very, very commonly held set of hypotheses at the time, which were there were these three huge problems which had to be solved, and if we solved those, there was a potential to get to that more mainstream user base. So the first was lack of liquidity. I think this is still touted as being the biggest problem for adoption of DEXs, which for various reasons we're no longer convinced of. The second was low speed, so the fact that every transaction, depending on how you design your system, will need to go on the blockchain eventually for settlements. And the third being a more complex user experience, so the very fact of using blockchain and wallets and taking control means that you have to be responsible for your own funds and sign in certain ways. And so we started imagining what we wanted this to look like, and this is what we ended up launching. So Ethernex Trustless had a very similar interface to a centralized exchange. So, and by that I also mean a high frequency limit order type exchange. So this is very familiar, except in the sense that you connect an existing Ethereum wallet. So you come along with a wallet which already holds Ethereum and other tokens and connect, and then can place orders. But the interesting thing here was that the order book is also the same order book that you get on the centralized exchange. So we'd essentially taken the existing liquidity, which is much higher on centralized exchanges, and made it available to people in a non-custodial way, trading from their own wallets. So that was pretty exciting to us. And the way that we did that was essentially, I don't think this diagram is very clear, but essentially by providing a gateway into the centralized exchange. So users lock up tokens and are then able to sign orders in a certain format, and actually we use the 0x protocol format and can submit them through our gateway, which then runs a whole series of checks on the orders, and if they're successful, we'll add it to the same order book that would be used by someone who had given up custody and used a centralized exchange. So you therefore are at that point agnostic to how the orders were placed, and once they're matched together, you pull out the signed orders afterwards and lazily match them and settle them on blockchain, on Ethereum. So the big benefit there is that you still get the high liquidity and instant execution of trades, but aren't waiting for the slower settlement, which then happens later on Ethereum. So kind of with those various steps, we solved the liquidity issue. We solved the fact that you could now have concurrent trading, because we would know that by the time your next order went through, although you might not have had a settlement yet, your balance will have updated. And you've also got no sign-ups, privacy by design, because you're using your own wallet rather than creating a new account. So essentially, we were pretty happy at this point. 6 months ago, we'd built this, we were ready to launch it, and we thought we'd solved essentially the three biggest problems. And we're ready to see if we could get huge adoption on this platform. And we launched it, and I think, as you might expect, things were quite slow to begin with, but there was a slow pickup in number of users and volume. Over the first month or two, a lot of typical bug fixes, user experience improvements, and by sort of end of November, early December, things were really starting to pick up. So in terms of volumes, we were seeing 1 million, then 2 million, and then we reached a peak of $8.1 million a day of trading here, which was an absolutely huge proportion of trading via sort of DEXs, at least non-custodial trading. But we were ready to congratulate ourselves in having solved these problems, but as soon as we started to look more deeply, I think, although there were a lot of transactions happening, the number of users was still actually only, I think, reached a peak of 250 daily users. And nearly all of those, once we looked at what they were actually doing through Trustless, were doing arbitrage operations between us and other exchanges, rather than being anything like sort of more mainstream users. So these were very specialized people. They understood blockchain, they understood DEXs very well, and they also were using multiple centralized and decentralized exchanges. So they were still really the early adopters, although they were very sophisticated. And I think this is the reality that then sort of broke through our naivety quite hard, was that even looking at all these other applications on Ethereum, the number of daily users, once we also started to pattern match between what they were doing on Trustless and where they're also interacting, is still less than 1,000 really, and it's mainly the small group of people, same small group of people, and very enthusiastic and knowledgeable. I mean, this was hammered home, particularly in kind of one of our first months, when someone managed to get about $800,000 stuck in one of the contracts temporarily, and they were obviously messaging us, trying to find out what had happened, and eventually we got it out about 12 hours later. And this guy was then very happy. He said, "Oh, thanks so much. Can I have a FNX t-shirt? I love using it." Having waited 12 hours to get his money out stuck. And that kind of is really, I mean, that could only be an early adopter, given that he also missed many arbitrage opportunities while he was waiting and everything else. So the reality of what we started to see, and when we kind of sat back down and started to analyze all of this, was that we were still looking right back at the beginning of that early adoption curve. And to really cross to mainstream, there's a much bigger chasm that we'd have to cross. And it's really based on these 5 elements of innovation that we started to measure. And the way we did this was by taking users of our centralized exchange and also actually other centralized exchanges and asking them to sit down with us, usually via sharing their screen, and use FNX Trustless for the first time. And suddenly we started to get this really rich set of feedback. And I think, as far as I know, this is one of the most comprehensive kind of series of user interviews that's been done in the space. And so a lot of these guys, and we tried to choose people who were already traders, so they knew, and usually had been for a while, so they knew a lot about cryptocurrencies. They'd been trading cryptocurrencies for a long time, but they hadn't necessarily, and surprisingly often hadn't, ever actually interacted with their own wallets or made transactions directly on Ethereum. And the first thing we saw really strongly was that we didn't have a really clear relative advantage. So in our view, the fact of having custody yourself was a huge benefit, and that itself would, was orders of magnitude enough to get people to come and use this. And that's not the way they saw it at all. They weren't clear on what the benefit was for them to hold it versus using a centralized exchange. It also wasn't very compatible with how they were currently holding their funds. So even those who did have Ethereum wallets would typically tell us that, for example, they used MyEther wallet as their wallet, and they didn't realize that they could use that anywhere else, that they could extract a key store file or private key, and had never done so. And the fact that also this was much more complex and difficult to try, because also your funds are at risk as soon as you're using it, and the benefits weren't very observable. So the real challenge that we kind of eventually, having summarized all of this, saw was this frictionless society, that everything in the last 2 series of decades has been about removing friction, removing barriers from UX, removing choice, and actually removing, wherever possible, the need for a user to think at all. And blockchains are clearly a very strong reaction to that trend. It's causing people to take back some of that control. It shifts the power back to us as consumers from the companies. But that obviously has really strong knock-on effects when you design a system which doesn't take into account what people are used to. And I think this is a well-known statistic that illustrates it really well, but even back in 2009, every additional 100 milliseconds cost Amazon 1% in lost sales, whereas you can only imagine what now the cost of having to have a MetaMask pop up for several seconds and block times of 15 seconds would have on people who actually want to do very quick trading, and where trading actually has a financial value depending on how quickly you can do it, because you may or may not miss an arbitrage opportunity. And we started then to look at how we actually build a bridge across this, and where we would need to start. And again, coming from these user interviews, the strongest starting point that we saw was going to be education, and I think that's very well, that's spoken about a lot in this space, but actually from an exchange point of view, that's something completely alien to us, to have to think about actually not just educating people about how to use our platform, but also how to use Ethereum, how to get a wallet, how to set up and start even interacting with the space. And we kicked this off really by looking at what our real value proposition is and how we make it really clear to people, and the fact that it's actually always a trade-off. So it's no good us saying If you use a centralized exchange, you could get hacked, you could lose your funds. I think that's been a lot of the messaging that's been going out about this sort of thing, but that doesn't connect with people and hasn't really communicated the real trade-off that there is, which is that on the one hand, by using something like Trustless, which is non-custodial, you get back control. And that has a lot of benefits. For Trustless, that means you've got no sign-ups, no loss of access to funds, it's permissionless access. But you also have, then, for an extra responsibility, and there's almost no getting around that fact, which is that you therefore must protect and back up your wallets, and there are no safety nets. And if we try and sort of make the case without mentioning that stuff, it usually doesn't work. You have to almost present it as a trade-off, and the fact that it's not sort of a win-win necessarily. It's a different value proposition. And actually, to get people to come and use these as mainstream customers, those safety nets, which actually they may really want, need to be almost given in another way, or even just through education about what the risks are. And the second huge one, which again is very well spoken about, is wallet onboarding. So we were lucky to then get some really useful statistics every time a user came and connected of what wallets they were using, but also what the conversion rates were for different wallets, as in how many people from coming to the site managed to get all the way through to actually trading. And one of the biggest things was that 80% failed to actually connect a wallet, whether that meant that they didn't have one or just didn't want to. But remember, this is also an automated process if you even have MetaMask often. So the process actually for a typical user coming for the first time would be, if you don't have MetaMask, and most didn't, at least of the traders that we took then from centralized exchanges, you have to go to another site, install the extension, come back, get some Ethereum on it, and wait 10 or 30 minutes. And by the way, you should have protected your wallet and backed it up, because otherwise anything that's on there is potentially at risk if you lose your device. And then come back and trade. And of course, we saw very different conversions depending on what wallets people were using as well. And so we started experimenting with various different other options. So one of the first ones we did was Portus, which has no installation. So from within Trustless, you press a button and you can create a new account with an email and password, which is a much simpler flow. It's also very familiar to people. And that works cross-device. So if you connect for the first time on your laptop and then use your iPad, you can still use it without having to worry about exporting and importing your private keys or whatever else. We saw really positive and interesting results just from simple things like that. So from before adding this and after adding it, we now see about, on average, about 14.5% of traders who actually use Portus. And also, the majority of those are people who didn't already have Ethereum wallets. So the nice thing is that if we then look at conversions of people who come who don't already have a browser-based wallet, then going through MetaMask versus going through Portus to ending up being able to trade is, I think, like a very significantly improved conversion. And I think there's all sorts of projects working on different ways of connecting, but that's probably still our biggest bottleneck, and surprisingly, the thing that's holding up a lot of what we're doing at this point. So where are we going next with this? So part of the reason why we are spending so much time right now on trying to make these investigations into where the barriers are and trying to test out and experiment with removing them is that what we're building at the moment and what we're investing most of our time into planning is the launch of a kind of more fully decentralized exchange, which will happen in 2019. So that will be a layer 2 scaling solution, and it'll have performance and scalability to rival what's possible potentially on a centralized exchange in many ways, as well as preserving privacy and solving some of the other front-running issues on maintain Ethereum. But actually, what's blocking, we think, adoption isn't going to be solved by the fact that this could be 100 times more scalable. It's going to be blocked still by the UX and by the education factors and by a lot of the other things which actually can't really be solved by us on our own. And so everything we're learning currently from Trustless, we're hoping to share, and we're also very willing to share any of the statistics that we have on wallet connections and wallet onboarding for anyone who's working on improved solutions for that sort of thing, and very much want to discuss if anyone else has similar learnings or has found improvements for that side of things, and hoping that we can start to really share a lot of the user interview work that we've done with other dApps. So yeah, that's it from me on Trustless, and if anyone has any questions, happy to answer.
So this whole idea of someone wants to use your app, you've got to get them onto Ethereum. It's obviously like a huge challenge. You've shown Portus, which from what I understood from what you said, is brings an email address and password back into the equation, which is just like, no, that's exactly what we're trying to get rid of. Have you seen anything else that's promising?
So I think there's Wallet Connect, Universal Login. There was a presentation earlier from Harborne Connect as well. All of these, I think, are very, very promising. But the danger is, so already we have six wallet connection options within our UI. That's a mind-boggling amount of choice if you're someone who doesn't already have an Ethereum wallet. And already, actually, we're starting to see the effect of having too many options is putting people off again, because how do I choose? You have to start pointing them towards one and recommending something which we don't really feel, we want to be quite agnostic. And if we started to integrate all of those as well, we're going to come into even bigger challenges. And some of those, I think, are better, are like much more smooth and quite fantastic user experiences, actually. But unless there's a standard and one that gets very widely adopted, we're going to have even more of an issue with then having 10 or 15 different options and asking a user to try and choose one. Any others, or hand over to Geordie? Sorry? Oh, yeah. What was the retention of Portus users? We haven't had it running long enough to say for sure, but part of our messaging around it is also partly that for many of our users, it may make more sense once they've experimented with it and started trading to start using a hardware wallet anyway. And actually, for most people who are doing large volumes through Trustless, end up using Ledger or Trezor. And I think compared to other dApps that we've looked at in terms of wallet statistics, we have a much higher ratio of hardware wallets, and I think that kind of makes sense. So it's partly, a lot of this is, okay, come and try it using these, but once you get familiar with it and enjoy it, try it with a hardware wallet.